Wonder if it's recording. There we go.
Okay. So let's see if this works. Now, have you seen my screen share?
Yes.
All right. I'm Jack Hoehn. I live in Walla Walla, Washington. And I think I'm here because I had a book published by Adventist Today called Adventist Tomorrow. It's on Amazon.com. It's available in a paperback and it's available as a Kindle. So about 1,000 plus copies have been sold so far. And this has brought me to the attention of some of the readers and some of the Sabbath schools. So I sort of suspect that that's why I'm here. Now, this book has a lot of chapters where I discuss other people's good ideas, which in my opinion would progress Adventism towards something more suitable for the 21st century than the 19th century. But I'm going to try something here, and I'm going to try to throw a net out and pull you all in. I'm fishing now because Adventism is a pretty tight family, and it's not too hard to find links with each other. So I'm going to tell you my links and see if I can pull all of you into my family so we can sort of personalize this talk this morning. I was born actually in Canada. My father was Gus Hoehn, my mother was Olive Hoehn, but we did go to Africa as they chose to be missionaries, and it didn't last too long because of illness. We came back to settle in Temple City, California. Harold Calkins was the best pastor I had there. I went to San Gabriel Academy. My classmates include John Hewson and Peter Christian Nelson, Bob Walls. My best principal and most influence on my life was probably Willie Bello, who later went to teach at PUC before he unfortunately died young in an airplane accident. I escaped every year to Camp Cedar Falls as a child from the Southern California heat. And later on, almost every summer, I worked there as a teenager. One summer, Jonathan Butler and I shared a cabin where we, for the winter in the daytime, and at the nighttime solved all the world's religious problems. I think G. Ray James was probably the most influence on my life as a conference youth leader. I was fortunate enough to go to Pacific Union College, where I met such luminaries as Dave and Jim Walters and Deanne Hoyland. I've noticed that when I talk to these men, most of them seem to remember Deanne more than they do me, but yeah, I mean, who would not be interested in a beautiful who came from paradise when you're a young theology major? But fortunately, she only married one of us. Of course, our deans, Don Coles and dear old Eva Bell Winning, were there. And I went for 1 year then to Seminar Schloss Bogenhofen. And some of you may have a Bogenhofen connection. Hans Heinz was the director in that time and was a wonderful teacher. Gerhard Fondel was a classmate of mine. Unfortunately, he didn't follow the same good progressive Adventist path I did, but we can forgive Gerhard for his conservatism. Otto Riegler was a teacher that many people that have been to Bogenhofen will remember. I did have a German major because of that year. I had a religion major, and I had a chemistry pre-minor and pre-med when I graduated. I came to your town there, Loma Linda, and I'm probably most famous because Hulda Crooks of Crooks Park is my aunt. And Hulda was a Hoehn, an older sister of my father. After medical school, I went back to Canada for various good reasons, including the Vietnam War, and I was a Canadian, but also because they had a good program there for family practice They also taught me to be a bit of a surgeon, which I needed in mission service, and an obstetrician. My dad, Gus, who was a dermatologist, helped me because I ran a leprosy hospital, and I became a jungle doctor. I worked in Lesotho, which is in South Africa, at Maluti Adventist Hospital. There I worked with Will Hurlow, Phyllis Collins, Twyla Reimke. Those are saintly women who you should know if you don't. I then took a break and went to the School of Tropical Medicine in London, went to school at Wimbledon, and then went to Zambia, where I really took over that mission hospital, worked with Alan Shepard, Don and Shirley Ashley, John and Sue Rogers, and Erida Mbangukira, wonderful people. After 13 years, almost 13, we came back and settled in Walla Walla, Washington. Jonathan, my son, and Andrew, my son, went to school here. Andrew married Alyssa Bowen from Moscow, Idaho. So I'm throwing the net very wide. And if there's anybody in this class who hasn't been pulled now in a little closer to me, I'll be surprised, because someplace in this net, you probably have a link. So we can progress now, and we're friends. Any comments or questions are welcome. You can interrupt at any time. This is a discussion of friends.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Now, I have no original ideas. In my book, Adventist Today, I have about 8 pages showing the resources that have given me every good thought I've ever had, every useful suggestion, every pregnant idea. And so if you want to know where these ideas come from, you can check out the back of this book, the last 8 pages. I'm going to introduce you to another book that some of you may know well, by Gary Wills. It's the one that I was rereading, was called Papal Sin. And as I reread this book, I got some more beautiful thoughts and ideas that just excited me. And because of that, I've written 2 more articles for Adventist Today. I'm going to reference them, but I want to give credit. And there is one more book called Stephen Greenblatt, The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve. If you haven't read that book and you're interested in our stories of Adam and Eve and the influence they've had in this world, I can recommend this book to you. I'm going to use that for a little story in just a minute now. So I just want to share these resources with you because they're pregnant. These are the 2 articles I have recently had published on AdventistToday.org online. The first one is called Do Angels Have Wings? And the second one's called In the Name of the Father, the Son, and the Motherly Spirit. And we're going to basically focus on these 2 stories a bit today, probably one of them today or part of them, and then maybe next Sabbath, the second one. So I'm going to tell you right now what I'm going to tell you. And if you already know this and it's not of interest, you can go out to the kitchen and finish your breakfast. Number 1 is, God knows we cannot understand truth without metaphor. And metaphor is the way that inspiration seems to have revealed truth to us. Number 2 is that metaphor mistaken lays a foundation for subordination of at least half of the human race and 1/3 of the Godhead. So those are the 2 summaries that we're going to discuss. I'm suggesting that there are metaphors and there's misophors and lostophors, which to me are words I've made up to explain what happens if a metaphor is misapplied or if it's mistranslated in translation from one storyteller to another. And the 2 points we're going to discuss mostly today, shrinking Eve, and the next time, the transgendering of God. So buckle your seatbelts. Now I'm going to just ask finally for one beautiful thing that Gary Will quoted for me. And he quoted to this French radical Christian named Simone Weil. And I have grasped this as such a beautiful truth that holds on to me. Simone says this: Christ likes us to prefer truth to him, because before he became Christ, he was truth. If one turns from Christ to follow truth, one will not go far before falling back into his arms again. This lady's long gone, but these words have resonated with my heart. And it's helped me a lot as I've watched our children and grandchildren be unable to follow the same path that Deanna and I followed. And yet, when I find that they turn from Christ in order to follow truth, the end is going to be good. And so those are the kind of things. Now, let me talk a little bit about Stephen Greenblatt, because he has a very interesting story. I'll just tell you who he is. He's a Harvard professor with a name like Greenblatt. You know he's Jewish. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner for the book here called The Swerve. The one I'm recommending for Adventists who are interested more in Adam and Eve. You will learn a lot by reading his The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, the story that created us. It's fascinating. He tells fascinating things that I never knew and have helped me, even though I thought I knew all about Adam and Eve. He is a specialist in Shakespeare as well, so all of these things, and some of you may already know him, but he was newly introduced to me. Now, let's tell a story. Oh, well, here's the verb. He will inform you while he entertains you. It's the kind of a book that educates you deeply, and yet it's a page turner. It's more fun than a novel to me. Anyway, good book. Now, in his book, he gives this introductory story. I'm going to retell it to you. Stephen tells of being in the house of worship on the Sabbath and being told by his Orthodox parents to be sure to keep his head bowed and his eyes closed when the rabbi spoke the Sabbath closing prayer, because at that moment, God passed over the congregation, and to look at God would be fatal, because who can look at God? Stephen writes this: I brooded on this prohibition. To look into the face of the Lord, I reasoned, must be the most wonderful thing any human being could experience. Nothing that I would ever see or do in all the years that lay ahead of me would even approach this one supreme vision. I reached a momentous decision. I would raise my eyes and see God for myself. It would be fatal, I understood, of course, as a child can understand, but the cost surely would not be too high. Now, I did not dare tell my parents of my determination, for I knew they would be distraught and tried to dissuade me. I did not even tell my older brother, Marty, because I feared he would reveal my secret. I would have to act alone. So the child made up his mind that at that charmed moment, as the rabbi prayed out the Sabbath, he must open his eyes. It took several Sabbaths for him to build up his courage, but the inspiration to see God with his own eyes was so dear to his little heart that after several Sabbaths, the decisive moment came. And as the rabbi began to say the ritual prayer, he tipped back his head, he forced open his tightly closed eye, and looked for his moment of glory. But he saw nothing. He saw the roof of the synagogue. He did not see God passing over the congregation of his chosen people as they reverenced the close of his Sabbath. In fact, what he did see was that quite a few other people in the congregation had their eyes open too, and none of them seemed particularly worried. And so begins the loss of faith for this great scholar and truth seeker. He had been told an untruth. How could he believe any of the rest of the things they would tell him? The Bible is full of things that are not factually true. How can we believe any of the things it tells us? Do angels have wings? Well, of course they do. The winged cherubim and the Ark of the Covenant have two wings covering the mercy seat. And well, Isaiah 6 saw seraphim who had 6 wings. With twain they covered their face, and with twain they covered their feet, and with twain they did fly. Well, obviously they have wings. Revelation, the New Testament, has heavenly creatures with wings about the throne of God. They must be seraphim too, because they have 6 wings. And not only did they have wings, but they're covered with eyes all around, even under its wings. And day and night, they never stop saying, holy, holy, holy. Why do they need eyes? And why do they need wings? Because Hebrews 1:4 says, well, angels are not physical, they are spirits. How do spiritual entities need physical wings? Well, there's this ladder between heaven and earth. Jacob saw it. He was sleeping by the road and he fell asleep, and he saw a ladder extending from heaven to earth. Well, how far is that ladder? Where is the heaven? And why were angels needing a ladder if they have wings? The heavens and earth were created in 6 days a few thousand years ago. Or was it 13.7 billion? Or was it 4.5 billion when the sun, or was it 3.5 when the first intelligently designed life forms? Or was it 120,000 years ago when the genetic Adam or Eve were, or was it 4,000 years ago for a Noah flood? Or do good poor men die and go to the bosom of Abraham? Or do rich bad men die and go down the fires of hell? If they don't, why did Jesus say they did? Well, you all know the answer. It's metaphors. They're all metaphors, or some of them are metaphors, or maybe part of them are metaphors, or they're partly metaphors. An angel having wings is false, but it's not a lie. As Gary Will says, to draw an angel with wings is an economy meant to suggest some idea of a higher being to the younger mind. It is false, but not a lie. It's an analogy. It's a presentation of something. Well, why not just inspire the Bible with the facts and nothing but the facts? Well, it appears that truth is budgeted to us, in the Bible anyway, in a heavenly economy. It's a budget in recognition of our developmental, educational, cultural limits. God has given out to each age as much truth as we could handle, suitable for the needs and abilities at that time, much like a parent would do to a child. When I was in the 2nd grade, my father gave me $6 a month. And that was a lot of money back then. It was the same price that it would have cost a school bus to be taken back and forth to school if I would ride my bike. So I rode to San Gabriel Union School on my bicycle and I earned $6 a month. It was quite generous. I had all the needs. I could stop at the little store on the way home and get some 5-cent candy bars, and I was well off with $6. And then in medical school, when Deanna and I got married and we were as poor as church mouse, my folks gave us tickets to Vancouver Island for our honeymoon. And that was worth hundreds of dollars. That was several $100s, maybe $4 in those days. We felt rich, no longer just $6 a month, now several $100s to meet our needs. We had a lovely honeymoon. We stayed in a family house and we were doing fine. Now, the story ends, of course, when Mom and Dad died. They divided up their residue that was left of their estate amongst the 7 children that my folks had or raised. And we got several $100,000 each. Oh, the issue is, well, they were going to give us several $100,000. Why didn't they give me all of that when I was 6 or 7? Or why didn't they give it all to me in medical school? Well, there's lots of reasons, but basically it was an economy. By loving children, parents for their children, they gave us what we needed, what we could handle at the time. Now, I would suggest that it appears that God has done the same with truth. He gives us a budget appropriate for our needs. And this may answer some of the questions why he doesn't just dump it all at once, or didn't thousands of years ago when the original documents were written. I'd like to just suggest a few texts suggesting to you that if you want to find this in the Bible, you can. I mean, Jesus says, what is the kingdom of God like? How can I illustrate it? Well, it's like a tiny mustard seed. A man plants it in a garden, but then it grows, it becomes a tree, and birds can make nests in its branches. So truth is given sometimes just as a little seed of truth. And then the purpose is over time, with development, with not only people growing up, but cultures growing up, civilizations growing up, truth grows, starting with seeds. Here's another text for you. Maybe truth is too much bigger than our facts, because as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So, put a ladder up to heaven and explain that there is a connection between heaven and earth, an invisible connection, but sort of like a ladder. Even visions and visionaries can't handle the truth. It is written, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, neither has entered into the heart of man or woman prophetess, the things which God has prepared for those which love him. So we can't expect even visionaries necessarily to have the whole truth. And even Jesus could not tell his followers the whole truth. He said to them, you don't understand now what I'm doing. Someday you will. And there is so much more I want to tell you, but you cannot bear it now. Help me understand that neither the Old nor the New Testaments are the whole truth, the truth. That the Bible has seeds of truth that must grow. That truth is progressive. Truth is limited by the time it was written, by the people who wrote it, by the people who recorded it, by the people who have told it and retold it to us. So I'm not going to take a breath now, and I want to hear a response from some of you. I want questions, and then after we sort of chew on this just a little bit, then I'll talk to you about one of the mistaken metaphors that we have fed ourselves.
Okay, just raise your hand and I'll put you in a queue, but can I ask you the first question, Jack?
You may ask me the second or the last.
Well, I'm going to ask you the first one. I think you and I are in the same book on in regards to metaphor, but what, I'm going to use the word hermeneutic, do you use to sort out metaphor from literal reality? That's a struggle I have, and I just would like to know what you do with it.
You mean, do I have a litmus test that I can dip
Oh,
into?
yeah,
each text?
just what kind of technique do you use? Just give me your thoughts on
Well, it's progressive.
it.
So the first thing is that I understand that at sundry times and diverse manners, God spoke to us through the prophets. But I have also understood that he says things that were contradicted and reformed by Jesus. So I'm with Gregory Boyd that says, I find that there has become a crucifixion of the Old Testament warrior God by Jesus Christ, who has revealed to us that he's not a warrior God and that he's not ruled by power and coercion and by fear but he worships only by love, self-sacrificing love. So my first is I'll accept what Jesus, I think, taught and then if the Old Testament agrees with him, we're good. If it doesn't, I say, well, that's an interesting idea, but I don't think it was true. Now that's you say it's subjective. Well, it might be, but it's not subjective to Jack. I try to make it subjective to Jesus. But then I will tell you that the New Testament too was written 2,000 years ago. There were things in the New Testament they could not know and did not know. And so how do I do? Well, I can learn from Martin Luther and I can check out what he thought. And then I can learn from Calvin a few things, not many, but some. And I could learn a lot from C.S. Lewis. I've learned a tremendous amount from Ellen White, and I learned from Dave Larson. And I learned from Stephen Greenblatt, and I learned. So I have not found it difficult for me to read the Bible and to find the seeds of truth, the beginning of truth. To me, the Bible has become a flashlight. It's not the destination. It's not the end of truth. It's the opening to truth. It's a gate. It's a door. And then you go through the door and then you walk into the world using the flashlight to help you see, but not to restrict truth, to open truth. And so I'm pretty open. And so far, so good.
Yeah. Well, the reason I say, because I think I'm going to say a lot of people, myself, when I first started struggling with this issue, well, those are lies. And then you say, wait a minute, they're not necessarily lies. They are telling a greater truth. That's kind of where I'm at with a lot of stuff in the Bible, especially the Old Testament.
I like the way I quoted to you from Gary Wells, who said, it's false, but it's true. And I can do that. And we can talk about all the details of the rich man and Lazarus and why that. Well, Adventists don't have too much of a problem with that because we figured out that there's no hell and we don't go to conscious life right after death and resurrection, all these things. So we can talk that one down, but some people can't. And I think we all need to be able to learn how to evaluate the story and see now what's the story teaching. What is the truth in this story?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I got David. He had his hand up too. David?
I'd like to come in after others have had a chance.
Okay. All right. Rodney?
Good morning, everybody. Jackie, you and I seem to have very, very similar interests. And you're on a journey of demystification of the language that the Bible uses. I've had some friends go down the road that you're going on, and they have actually left the church. It's just been too much for them to process, too confusing. On the other hand, I'm a person who was on the margin of the church, who went down this road that seemed to be on, and it clarified so much for me. And I'm more devout in my God believing today than I was. I call it a journey of demystification. We're trying to understand what these metaphors mean, and how they have truths. What is a metaphor, and where did they even come from? And my approach was the understanding that these stories were actually borrowed by the Jews. They came from a time, many of these stories did. And the answers to me, and what I found the satisfactory answers to many of them were by understanding the ancient Mesopotamians, the Akkadians, the Sumer, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, and what stories have been extracted from there. And for example, one of the, and I'll be brief on this, one of the Orthodox Jews that I read explains that the ladder was never a step ladder. He pictorialized it in your slide. That word ladder came from the steps of the ziggurat, where the ancient Nephilim were trying to outdo each other as gods, as gods, as building gods, and were building ziggurats. That was a sign of their deity. Nothing to do with a ladder that we understand as a ladder that went up into the sky. Even a ladder, these ladders were only 5 to 7 stories, and they were trying to build them bigger, but they looked like a ladder. They worked like a ladder. People entered the top story by walking up a ladder, and that's the oldest story of the ladder story that I can come up with. The other one is an interesting one with the angels. From the very beginning, the Nephilim of Genesis 6 are recorded as wearing angels. They were apparel that was attached to them. That was a sign of the rank of the gods in what we would call mythology today. And they were never functional angels. So from that point of view, that has carried on, and even the Navy, the Air Force today are assigned wings, and they are epaulets. And it's no different in the ancient times. That was what was an angel. Astronauts wear apparel with wings on it to indicate their rank and that they're airmen. It was no different in the time of the Sumer and the Akkadians. And it's a carry-on of tradition that goes back to ancient times. So my exploration might take me in a different journey, but my bottom line here is we would do well, writers like you would do well, who pull from their sources and demystify so much of the stories that we try to pass on to children and grandchildren who are just not going to buy it. And frankly, they shouldn't buy it. They shouldn't buy some of the very simplistic, not just adolescent, but infantile stories that we want them to buy. Let's stop it and do the best explanation of the metaphors as we can understand them from the ancients.
Thank you. There is some breakup either in my internet or yours, so some of that was a little broken, but I think I appreciate your comment, and I have nothing to add. Any other question for us?
I have, I don't see, David, I guess I'll come to you. Oh, no, man, Peter just raised his, Peter, you go.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation. I think we're in agreement that the truth is progressive, that God considered that we cannot stand to give us the whole truth. There is a lot of truth about him, his creation, about his plans for us and for the universe. But can you mention, how can you make a distinction if the whole Bible or majority of it is a metaphor and what is direct speech? Because Jesus, when he was quoting the Bible, he didn't quote it as a metaphor, he quoted as a direct speech. And I know that in the history of Christianity in the 1st century, Origen tried to read the Bible allegorically. You are reading it metaphorically. Well, again, how can we make distinction between what is metaphor and what is direct truth? You mentioned also one book, People Sin, and I didn't understand in what context did you use that book and what is basically the People Sin that you are referring to. You also mentioned Simone Weil, which about the truth about Jesus, that basically we start with truth and going to, starting with Jesus, going to truth and vice versa. Simone Weil was a mystic a Christian mystic. And are you quoting her as a Christian mystic? Consider her when you are making this quotation about Jesus and truth. Thank you.
Peter, I don't quote anyone as an authority. I quote them because they say things in a way that makes things clear to me or excites me. And so I'm not saying that Simone Weil is the authority. I'm saying she said something beautiful and I think true, because the truth is Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He became the Son of God and the Messiah by his experience, but he was the truth and the life and always the eternal word. And so her point is, Jesus was always truth before he became Jesus. He had a pre-existence, and the Christian teaching is an eternal pre-existence. And he was truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. He became our Savior. He died on the cross. He was resurrected. He was declared to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead. And so I just thought it was a beautiful thing. And it's helped me because I've watched my children turn away from my Adventist love to follow either sometimes a very spiritual life without any religion, becoming sort of nuns. But I see also watched them long enough now wander away. Oh, Dad, that's all bogus. There's no such thing. To come back and say, yeah, there is thing. I just can't call him God anymore because you Christians have destroyed God. So I call him Source. But he's real and angels are real. And I know that now. So it's just, I like the way she said it. Regarding, things on the Bible, what's literal or what's not. Well, it's very helpful to know it's impossible. I mean, if you know that it's not possible that the world was created in 6 24-hour days, then it's pretty easy to say, okay, that's not possible. It didn't happen that way. It's clear from all kinds of evidence, multiple lines. Well, then what does it mean? And then I can go and find the seeds of truth in that story. I think the Genesis story tells us exactly the truth about what God did and why. I think it says nothing about when or how. So, the 6-day creation, I know why it was retold in 6 days, because he wanted to give us a Sabbath. And the reason we have a Sabbath is because God presented the creation story in 6 days and made a seventh. So that story was told in order to create the Sabbath. The day and night are created by the rotation of the earth. The months are decided by the moon. The year is decided by the circulation of the sun. All those timekeepers we have are done by nature. The Sabbath has no natural cause. The Sabbath is only caused by the Genesis story. So God created the Sabbath, just like he created other physical. He created this calendar for us by telling the story as if it were 6 days. But so that's just one little bit. I don't want to spend the rest of the time talking about creation or literalism or symbolism. I'm just going to present this morning that the Bible is full of metaphor, and good metaphors are helpful. And I'm afraid there's 2 metaphors that we have misused. And when Forrest is ready, I'm going to go on and talk about the rib metaphor.
I do have Dr. Larson, though, that had his
I'm
hand up.
interested in hearing about the rib. Let's keep moving.
Okay,
I'd
we'll
like to
go
hear
there.
about the rib.
And by the way, Jack, did you, somebody's talking?
I said, Forrest, when you have a minute, I would
Oh.
like to do a fast explanation on the word mystic about that was very misrepresented of Simone. Quickly.
Well, anyway, let's
When you
go
have
to,
time. Yeah.
let's go to Jack. But Jack, in the movie, It's a Wonderful Life, don't angels get their wings when a bell rings or something like that? So.
Good movies have some truth in them.
Okay,
I'm going to talk about a metaphor, a specific one now.
Sure.
And this is my last presentation this morning. And I'm going to convince you that I want you to stop using this metaphor. And the name of this second talk is Not a Rib. Now, I'm talking to Loma Linda, so I think there's an anatomically, medically people there, but I'll just remind you, okay, humans have 24 ribs. The top few are connected to the sternum. The bottom two are sort of floating out there. We have 12 on each side. It is not true that males have one less rib than females, which has been amazingly taught for hundreds and thousands of years as a truth that, well, obviously, because God took one rib to make woman, men have one less rib than females. It's never been true, but you'll find it discussed. So interesting. The ribs help us to breathe. The intercostal muscles between the ribs pull the ribs up and out, and the thin diaphragm contracts and flattens down. And with the ribs going up and the diaphragm going down, they inflate our lungs. So they're very important structures to help us breathe and have this wonderful breath of life. Most creatures, including all mammals that I know, are bilateria. That means we are two-sided. Now, jellyfish or sponges don't have two equal halves. They're just one round with no left or right side. But most animals, especially those of us with ribs, are bilateral. We have a right side and a left side. We have one half on this side, the other half on the other. Dogs have 13 pairs of ribs. Snakes have many, many more. The turtle had 8 ribs that were fused into making its external shell. Now, fish are bilateral, but they have 2 ribs on each of their vertebrae, 2 on the dorsal and 2 on the ventral. But sharks only have 1 short ventral on each vertebra. Lampreys have no ribs at all. So there's a lot of variation, but in general, have 2 ribs. Now, in the King James Bible, the word fifth is used as a rib. The word fifth, or chomesh from chomesh, 5, is a lethal point of entry for killing. Under the 5th rib on your left side would put the sword into your heart. Under the 5 lower ribs would put your spear into the belly, as most modern translations seem to prefer. In either case, as the Bible says, when Abner kills Ashiel, Joab's brother, and then when Joab kills Abner because of this, and then when 2 former soldiers kill Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth, and Joab kills his cousin Amasa, who joined Absalom against David, all of them died using the same anatomical method, and they smote him there under the 5th that he died. So there's sort of a rib. It's not really the word rib, it's the 5th, giving some sort of relationship perhaps to the ribs. Now, there is a proper anatomical Hebrew word for rib. It's Allah, and it's found in Daniel, where the Medo-Persian bear has 3 Allah in his mouth. So that is a rib. This Medo-Persian bear took 3 different kingdoms and comes up in the vision. Now we're coming back to another Hebrew word called tselah. This is the root word. This is sort of the Strong's Concordance word. There are, of course, varieties in the way it's used and prefixes and suffixes, but the root is tselah. 40 times it's used in the Bible. In all 40 times, it's translated as side, as in one of 2 sides. For example, in 1 Kings 6:15, the tselah is the planks of cedar on the cella of a room. Unless the room is round, most rooms being square, it's one of the sides of the room. There could be 4 sides in the room. In Exodus 37:3, there are rings on each side of the ark where the priest would put in poles to carry it. There were rings on one cella and then rings on the other cella. And they would put rings on each side of the ark, put it on their shoulders, and then move the ark when the tabernacle had to move. In Exodus 26:35, the table of showbread was on the cella of the holy place. And that, in this case, it was the north cella, or the north side, or the north half of the holy place. And so it puts the table of showbread on the north. And in 1 Kings 6:34 and 35, the word cella is used for the two cedar sides of the one door leading into Solomon's temple. So it was a door, but it had two cella, a right side of door and a left side of the door. In every occurrence in the Bible, cella is translated as side or half, except once. The 41st time in Genesis 2:21 and 22. So it says God took one cella of Adam, and the English translation, starting with Wycliffe, said rib. Why did they not say took one of Adam's sides or one of his two halves? This mistranslation started with Wycliffe through the King James Version, has been entrenched in most English Bibles, that we use the word rib. It's not the anatomical word for rib. It's never used rib the other way, except like in a boat. Maybe the boat has staves, which would be like ribs on the boat, but the really meaning is the boat has stays on each side. It's not a technical word for rib. So what's the difference? This is a metaphor. Well, woman was made from Adam's rib. Well, there is a metaphor. And the question is was woman created for Adam as one of his halves, one of his sides, or was he 1/12 or 1/24 of a man? Was cella side, half, or one rib? You begin to feel the difference in the idea of who woman is. Now I'm going to suggest another idea to you. I was presented as a child, well, this was anesthesia. God put him asleep and did a surgery and took out a rib and then stitched it up and then took the rib and made a woman to stand next to Adam. But the deep sleep, or tardema, which I think is the root word that God puts Adam into, was not surgical anesthesia. It was a dream or a trance, like God put Abraham into. In Genesis 15:7-12, God and Abraham are covenanting. And God tells him, well, take your 3-year-old virgin cow and your 3-year-old female goat and your 3-year-old male sheep and divide them into 2 halves and place one half on one side and one half on the other. And then Abraham falls into a deep sleep or trance, no surgery involved, and God reveals himself in his deep sleep or his dream as a moving pillar of cloud and pillar of fire that passes between the 2 halves of the bilateral animals, the right and left halves. To Abraham, this meant God was taking a solemn oath, a way of making a covenant that must be kept, offering himself to be hewn asunder like those animals were if he did not keep his word. But there was no anesthesia involved, no surgery when Abraham went into a tardema or a sleep. I don't think there was any surgery involved when Adam was put into a trance. Adam's sleep to me was a spiritual trance. In the Greek translation, the Septuagint, the word used was ecstasis, which literally means standing outside of oneself, an out-of-body experience. Adam was out of his body watching God slice him into half, turn that half into a woman. He replaced in the dream the body parts for Adam. He supplied the body parts that Eve, and then Adam awakes from his deep sleep, not with a sore side with stitches in it, but with this beautiful half, his 50-50 equal, one of his two sides, not one little rib taken to make a woman. If you are bilateral, like most mammals are, then one side of you is one half of you. The woman being introduced was not 1/12 of his rib cage. It was not one bone of his 270 human bones, one unnecessary thing that could be used to make a woman. It was one of his halves. It was his side. So what's the dream revealing? What is the vision given to Adam and given to us of what woman is? God was revealing to Adam that this woman was half. She was one side of a two-sided humanity, not a 1/12 of a rib, not but one of the two sides of humanity. Now, Adam, we have this idea, well, he was formed of dust. And I've heard some people say, well, you see, Adam was made of dirt, but Eve was made of something more complex than dirt, so woman is more complex with man. Yeah, maybe that's true, but I'm not sure exactly what that means. In Genesis 2:19, the animals were also formed of the dust. So we have this precious idea of God kneeling down and forming Adam, and then once he is all sculptured as this perfect man, kissing him and giving him a breath, and he becomes alive. Well, Genesis actually says the animals were made the same way. The animals, like man, were also formed from the dust. So if you have this mystical spiritual experience of the man being formed, you should have the equal experience of the duck-billed platypus being formed, or the hyena, or whatever animal you want to make. Man, like animals, was chemical. He was dust, he was mortal. He was given a gift of life. And if that breath of life was taken back, humans, mortal, return to chemistry. Genesis 3:16, dust thou art, to dust shalt thou return. A creation story in Genesis 2 is explaining human nature with story full of metaphor. It's not a scientific explanation of how chemistry becomes biochemistry, or how biochemistry becomes complex cells, or how complex cells become living beings. It's a statement of our chemical, biological, and spiritual natures being one. It is a revelation of what humans are, not how humans came to be. So Adam's dream is not a scientific vision of women's origin. It is a vision of women's place in the order of creation. She was half of humanity. She is one side of mankind's two sides. She is the one cella of our two sides. She is the one cella of the two doors that led us into the temple. The one cella of the box in the holy place. She is the one cella of God's two-tablet law. She is half of whatever humanity is. In the New Jack version of Genesis 2, the Bible would read like this. Yahweh God formed the human of dust from the soil. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human being became a living being. Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he placed the human. But Yahweh God said, it is not good for the human to be alone. I will make him an equal helper. So he had the human name all the other animals formed from the soil, but found no equal helper for himself. So Yahweh God put the human into a trance where he saw God take one of his two sides and close up the flesh. And Yahweh God turned this half of man into woman and brought her to the man, who exclaimed, at last, finally, this is what I've been waiting for, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. not my little rib. She shall be called Isha, woman, because from Ish she was taken. Therefore men leave parents and join with a woman, for they are really two sides of one flesh. This version of the Bible has not been printed yet, maybe someday. I'm going to tell you that Ellen White is the same thing. If we just cross out the word rib, which she read in her Bible, and put in the proper translation. Let's try this from Patriarchs and Prophets. Eve was created from the side of Adam, signifying that she was not to control him as the head, nor to be trampled under his feet, but to stand by his side as an equal, a part of man, bone of his bone, and flesh of his flesh. I would probably cross out part and say half of man, or an equal part. She was his second son, the closest union and affectionate attachment that should exist in this relationship. They shall be one. 1 plus 1/12 does not make 2. 1/2 plus 1/2 makes 1. So here's my request. We've got to stop ribbing. Many male lips have ribbed women, and it helps me to understand how the translation error has served to mentally diminish women from their equality at creation. Because after all, there was this big, beautiful man formed by the hand of God, and then there was this thing or this other subservient taken from a rib from his side. I have had to learn that my sisters are not a rib. We are two equal sides of humanity. We are the two genders necessary to image the Creator. A man with a paralyzed side is a cripple. They're called hemiplegic, as we've seen in some stroke victims. Like Jacob, whose hip was dislocated in struggling with God, who touched his side and dislocated his hip, they ever after limp along needing a crutch. Hebrews 11:12 says, till the end of his life, Jacob was disabled by the loss of one of his sides in that battle. Till the day of his death, he worshiped leaning on a crutch. Well, the church that does not recognize women's full equality in service will be hemiplegic, crippled with one weak side, limping along on crutches instead of running quickly towards the kingdom of God. The male headship heresy promoted by some of my brothers must be challenged, not only as unchristlike, but also as an unbiblical view of female diminution. John Mark Reynolds says this: if Genesis is true, if you believe male and female are deep categories that are tied to the creation of humankind and the image of God, then to fail to hear a woman's voice on a topic would be to fail to hear something the Holy Spirit is saying to our generation. This is why we must have male and female pastors in our church. When Jesus stumbled on the way to Calvary and said to the women who were weeping for him, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves. He was not talking to ribs. We are each halves.
Dr. Hoehn and Pastor Howe, is this a good time to take a break? Okay, I see his. So it's about 8:37. Let me just come. I'm smiling here, having a good time, because I'm also remembering Plato's Symposium, which says that sexual dimorphism means that we are split in half. Half of androgyny was a single person, but the gods found androgyny to be too arrogant, so they split androgyny in half, and now half of us is male, half of us is female, and if we're not careful again, God will split us again, and we'll walk around like statues with only one arm and only one leg. So my point is that Dr. Hoehn has pointed out rightly that this halfness in the Bible is a blessing, but in the symposium, it's a punishment. Now, Anastasia, who is a classicist and whom we call Sister Resurrection, because that's literally her name, Sister Resurrection will help us understand the symposium. But I think the symposium and Genesis take very different views on the fact that we are half one, half the other. So we'll see what happens when we come back. Okay, it is now 11:38. Should we come back at what?
Let's say 11:50.
Okay, 11:50, 12 minutes.
Oh, thank you. I thought you guys would. Okay. Well, so with your permission, what we'd like to do for part of the digital foodless potluck is to discuss the future of the RBLSS class. As many of you know, Dave and Bronwyn and Forrest and Barbara and Lisa and Monty for several years have dedicated their time to host and manage this class. And Dave, as he shared in his email about the possible end of the class March 25, deserves some respite. We'd like to explore if there is a possibility of continuing. And so we'll be discussing some options that were discussed during the week amongst the leadership group, and get your feedback. So please stay and contribute to the conversation.
Okay,
Okay, thank you, McKinley. Maybe I can make a comment for us. Is that all right?
go ahead. Go ahead.
I see Jack has put here, have all heard that Dr. John Dibdall went to his rest on Wednesday. That's a very important thing for us to note. He died with Parkinson's disease. I don't know if he died from it. As you folk know, that's a merciless disease. I talked to him a while ago, and he very much wanted to be with us. But then on second thought, he said, no, my speech is not reliable. And so even though I'd like to be with you, I can't be. So he was a tremendous man, and we will miss him. Finally, if you want some fun, I'm sure you do, please read Genesis 1 through 3 and read the Symposium by Plato. And see if you don't agree with me that one makes the differences, such as they are, not total, such as they are, between man and woman a blessing, and the other one makes it a curse. So read it and find out for yourself. Okay, over to Forrest.
Okay, I want to go to Sister Resurrection. So again, you're going to ask your short question. And we'll go on from there.
Some things don't change. I'm glad you're there. Thank you. And absolutely, absolutely, there are things in antiquity as well as in modern times that are wrong. I want to thank our presenter, and I'm terrible, unless I see the person, it's almost I cannot speak, I cannot see him, but I want to thank him. I thank you very, very much for your scholarship and your life, and thank you for the contribution. If I can remember what I was trying to say about, I'm especially impressed that you have read some of Simone Weil's writing, and she's a very inspirational person. And I would say she was radical for her time, but not for our time. She was ahead of her time. She was a genius. At 12 years old, she was in perfect knowledge of Greek and the classics, and also the Indian, and so on and so forth. So one thing I would say is what in the Protestant lexilogion, and especially the Adventist, the word mystic is almost like a curse. And it's not witchcraft, and it's not what many people think it's mystic. While grew up in Jewish, by blood Jewish, by citizenship French, but atheist environment. Her parents were Jewish, and she had a revelation, a mystic, like Paul did, experience while she was visiting Assisi's either home or church. I'm not quite sure right now. And she had come to Jesus experience. But so when we say mystic, it's not witchcraft. It's actually an experience that it's from in the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, being quiet and communicating with God. For Pentecostals is in tongues and so on and so forth. So that, and also the word radical. Many people of those times, yes, it was considered radical, and some of the right-wing people, or extreme right-wing especially, is considered radical because at age, she dressed like a man, and she very much got in heart in the calling about the poor. Besides the classics, she's a fantastic classicist, and as well knows her Bible very well. So she got a calling about the labor, and I tried to be very quick. So she dressed like a man because at that time women could not work as workers in a factory. And she worked for a whole year in a factory to see the horrible situations of and injustices of labor. So today we have social security, we have compensation, we have unions. It was nothing at that time. So in that sense, she was radical, and in that sense, she was a communist, but she was not a pro-Russian, and she was not a communist for that, but rather for the ideas. And the rest also, I thank you very much, sir, for your Greek word, of course, ecstasis, which I think it was in Chartier's, Dr. Chartier's book about the love of God for his creatures and his creation. And also we saw in many of the Greek Orthodox that God created in ecstasies. His love was not as for an egoistic love for himself, but outside of himself. And I thank you very much, and I'm very privileged and that I'm here and listening to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Did I make it, Forrest? Did I make it? Or
You
will
did, you
the
did.
corner?
2 seconds, you made it by 2 seconds.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Did you want to respond to that, Jack? Or?
No, that's wonderful.
Okay, all right.
I don't know Simone Weil, but I have heard all those things. And to me, none of them say, oh, be careful, this is a dangerous woman. Some of them say she was far ahead of her time.
Okay, thank you. And in our interest of going to male, female, keeping everybody on the same sides, I'm going to go to David Beglin now. David?
Yes. In my reading of the Bible, the sections of poetry, I can easily recognize simile and metaphor and synecdoche and metonymy, part for a whole for a part, and all those wonderful figures of speech. But my hermeneutic has been for the prose sections of the Bible that you take the Bible literally where possible. And when not possible, then you consider it as being metaphorical or symbolic. But I do want to just say, by the way, I really like your, rib metaphor for what is actually the side. I think that's great. But I just got to wondering, I always thought of angels as actually having wings, literally. I didn't particularly think of any reason why they shouldn't have wings. Now, they're probably shapeshifters when they appear to human beings. The Bible records that they often appear as men, that is, as humanoids. But and I don't suppose that they could rapidly travel through space and get to Daniel by the end of his prayer by the mere flapping of wings. But my point is there any reason to negate the literality of wings, that seraphim have 6 and cherubim have 4?
It's you have to let me know, because I have felt angels And I think I once heard one. I have never seen one. But it's amazing the number of human beings that have had mystical experiences. Actually, if you talk to the population at large, have you ever had some mystical or spiritual experience that you can't explain? And many of them, they will say, even if they're not believers, well, I saw Jesus, or I saw the light, or I heard the, or, you know, I had some experience. So I think, you know, angels may present themselves with wings as part of their explanation of who they are or where they came from. If you look into the Assyrian and Babylonian art, you have these winged animals which are there, and so that was part of the ancient Near East gods. Some of them had wings. So I don't know how much of that is something we needed. I just know the Bible presents them as having wings. I don't think they have wings. Now, does a spirit have wings? I mean, does God have a finger? Does God sit on a throne? How can God, who is spirit, how do these things make any sense, except as help me understand that which is otherwise not understandable by bringing it down to my level? So good question, David. You let me know if you have a better answer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to go to Simona now. Simona?
Thank you. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I'm going to concentrate on your second one. And I'm going to posit that this misinterpretation of the value of a woman was intentional. This was not a mistake. It was an intentional thing that was done to diminish a woman out of fear of a man, and because men in particular, exchanged the power of love for the power. And I think this is a very important thing to understand, that, you know, regaining the balance, returning the woman to her rightful place is an important thing for not just the church, but for the world as well. And as I often said, you know, if we quiet the voice and the thoughts of half of the population, we are all missing out. The second thing is that stems from that: how much has the church suffered as a result of this false male supremacy idea? How much has the idea of male supremacy actually hurt the main purpose of the church, which is to serve, and to serve everybody equally, and to be served by everybody equally? And finally, you know, I want to go back to that idea that I think is not often mentioned, and say, you know, when God said it is not good for a man to be alone, I think there is a lesson there, because the growth requires challenge. And human growth requires a different view. So if we are only listening to things that we agree with, only listen to our own voice in our own head, then, you know, we're missing out on our own growth. And I think that we complete each other by being different, not by being the same.
Okay.
Simone, I believe I agree with you. I'm sure that there was intentionality in making the wrong choice on how to translate this word. I believe there has been systemic sexism, which has prevented even modern translations from doing the right thing. I wrote the, what's his name? Robert Alter, who has translated, who has a lovely translation of, I think it's called the Fox translation. He's did the Pentateuch, and I think maybe he's done the rest of the Old Testament. I wrote him once and I said, why did you say rib instead of side? And he said, I don't know. You know, he was kind enough to respond. And I've done that a lot. I mean, my understanding as a little boy in Sabbath school of hearing the Adam and Eve story and seeing the garden and playing in the sandbox and putting the felts up and hearing that this is the way Adam was made, God specially did every part. And then for Eve, he took a rib out and zapped it quickly into a woman. It was a different quality of creation, and it was diminutive. And nobody told me that. They said, well, women and men are together and we're all equally good, but one has to be the head. And so it was reinforced subconsciously. I just want every Sabbath school class to stop telling the story as rib. I want them to use a better word. I want them to say his half, his side. And then, if they're really smart, they'll explain that it wasn't surgery, that this was a vision, this was a dream. This was to help Adam understand that he needed an equal partner and that she was, in fact, exactly his equal, and that this was God's plan at the beginning. Everything that's happened has been a degeneration of the original plan. And if we start there, it will help little boys like me not to grow up thinking, well, aren't you glad that you're a boy? I am. I like being a boy, but I don't like being the idea that it would be bad to be a girl.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Simone, was that it?
I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, okay, all right. Jack, you made me think that what was one of the things that the Pharisees said, thank God that I'm not a woman.
It's terrible. And if you want to understand how the story has been molded to form the way we are now, which includes the subordination of women across the universe, and just slowly we haven't crawled back in our church. We're struggling to crawl back in the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, when will we have enough women on the Supreme Court? She says, when we have 9. She's right. That's the answer. But crawling back to, if you read this book by Stephen Greenblatt about the history of the Adam and Eve story, he especially points out St. Augustine screwed it up. And then he points out John Milton, who somewhat improved, still emphasized these points in a way that influenced Ellen White. And I'll just mention one thing here. Ellen White visioned the great controversy. We are told she visioned it or dreamed these scenes and retold them. Do you know that John Milton visualized in visions Paradise Lost? That every night for month after month after month, he would have a vision with a heavenly angel come to reveal these things to him. He would wake up and dictate them to his amanuensis. He said he was being milked of what the angel had given him during the night. I had no idea that paradise was also a visionary experience. To the blind poet, who every night was given a portion that he would write down in the day. That was fascinating to me. I thought our great controversy was just the dream story, but Milton's was too. But again, the way St. Augustine formatted that story, the way Milton did, the way most religious organizations have formed our view of women as somehow diminished.
Okay, all right, thank you. Rodney, coming back to you.
Yes, are you getting feedback or am I now clearer with the?
Well, so far you're fine.
Okay, all right. Again, I'll call you Jack. I really appreciated your presentation much more reasoned belief on this ancient story. And yes, I believe Wycliffe was a key problem for Protestants in terms of modern Bibles, continuing this story and continuing the misunderstanding. And I'm going to offer you a variant of what you said, an alternative. It comes from a Hebrew rabbi scholar that I read, and it may be right and it may be wrong. And that doesn't really matter in the sense that it is more reason, but I will not accept anything that subordinates women. And the ancient story, as told by Protestants, does that. And I think that is both unnecessary and unwarranted in the interpretation of the Hebrew words. My understanding at this point is that the Hebrew word that from the derivative of rib includes the sternum. And you see, if you think of the sternum as the primary rib, and the ribs going to the side as secondary ribs in the construct of a book, the rib of a book is the central spine, and the leaves of the book, the pages of the books, emanate from there. But the primary rib is central. It is not lateral. I like that concept. So when I also have a background in, I worked for 4 years in bone marrow transplant research, and I do understand God to be a creator and also a geneticist, the superior geneticist. So when the Bible says that Adam was anesthetized, I accept that, and in a modern sense, and that he was laid on his side. And why would God do that? Well, why does bone marrow transplantation people do that today? It's to expose the sternum, to take from the sternum, the central rib, the T cells and the rich blood cells that are available there, and also available on the iliac crest of the hip bone. Man is laid on his side even today. But what are they wanting? What did God want? He wanted the T cells, the building blocks, blood cells, whereupon with the central part, the formative part of Adam, and he used those to construct Eve. There was no laterality in it. It was central. It was never a rib. And the Adventist, a little side story of my mother was the rib that God used was over a man's heart. Well, how sweet is that? It's a lovely thought. But the fact is, there is no basis for this. So from that point of view, I just take it that there was a creative anesthesia event, a surgery event, and God took the central building blocks, T cells that are necessary to form another human being. Eve was, in my mind, with this interpretation, was always central, was never lateral, was never subordinated. So I'm sitting at the moment with understanding that technique, and I absolutely agree with you that the rib story needs to end. I think it needs to end from a singular rib. I think it also needs to end, it would take further study on my part, but I think it needs to end in terms of any laterality aside. Well, he didn't take the side. I don't believe God took the side and created another human being from the side of from Adam. But I will continue to be open on this and to study this. But I do see it as a surgical event, a creative event in the construct of a bone marrow transplantation, taking the essential cells of Adam and creating a woman. She was always central. Thank you.
Rod, that's fine, as long as you end up with not diminishing women. It's a little difficult for me to have this bone marrow transplant done into a petri dish and then growing her from those stem cells into a full human and getting it all done on Friday afternoon before sunset, which was coming soon because, he'd spent the whole morning naming the animals. There's quite a few of those. And then he had to have the sleep, and then they had to have, and they had to grow Eve from that. It very quickly boggles my mind to try to be very literalistic with this. It's much easier for me to say, it's not possible to be literal the way it's told. It could, I'm not saying it couldn't have happened the way you said, but it certainly didn't happen in 6 days in a 12-hour sunrise to sunset day, and to be all done before sunset. I mean, I had to get married after that too, because
Yeah.
then they, leave. So that was a very
Yeah.
busy Friday afternoon.
Yes, I would see, in my thinking, I would never try to fit it into that paradigm. It doesn't fit into that paradigm. It doesn't even fit into a petri dish paradigm. And so that would be a longer discussion that we would have.
Right. I'm mocking it. And
Yes, I understand.
That's not fair. That's not fair, but we're having fun this morning.
Yeah.
Yes,
well,
yeah.
Right.
Jack, it was called the preparation day. So, and maybe that's why God had to rest on the 7th, because he was so busy. Anyway, I'm going to come back to Simona. Simona?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to St. Augustine, what you mentioned, I highly recommend for everybody to read a book called Vita Brevis by Jostein Gardner. And it's
You repeat that, Simona?
I'll put it in the chat.
Oh,
Vita
good. Right.
Brevis, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
And it's a collection of letters, or a very long letter that has been written over a long time by Floria Emilia, who was St. Augustine's common law wife, with whom he had a son, and whom he abandoned and locked up in a monastery and took her child from her. And I'm sorry, any man who does that kind of thing is not a saint. So, this is not a real letter. He's just using the story to create this letter where he talks about the hypocrisy of somebody who is considered a saint. And I think it's important to remember that behind most big men of the antiquity and the past, and even today, there is often more than one great woman whose name has been forgotten. And many a man has taken the words of women in their lives, their ingenuity, their scientific work, their written work, and sold it as their own. And we see that even today. So much of the stuff that we apply and believe were done by men have been done by women. Only those women are not known, and we will never be known.
Hey, thank you.
That's an interesting story. I mean, I understand it's a work of fiction, of imagination, but the reality is exactly
That's
as
correct. Yes.
the reality is exactly as you say.
So
Augustine,
it is false, but it's not a lie.
he had a mistress and he lived with her a long time. Again, I was greatly educated by Greenblatt's book, and it has a lot of details that I didn't know and puts it into a context where I can appreciate what you're saying.
Okay. Before I get to Anastasia, Dana, did you want to ask your question? You put it in the chat early on. Did you want to ask that? It's not really what we've been talking about, but
yeah, no, thank you. It's more rhetorical. It has to do with the first presentation. The second one, it's a lot more, I don't want to say interesting, but it brings a lot more passion to the discussion. So I want to stay here with the second presentation. Thank you so much, which I really, really enjoy. Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Thank you. I'd like Anastasia.
Yes, quickly. Thank
Yes,
you.
please.
Thank you again so very much. I would like to say that a few years ago, Loma Linda had a visitor, Richard Hayes, and understand he was also the mentor and teacher of Tornstad, but I was greatly impressed, and I have his book, Moral Vision of the New Testament, and his suggestion is, which supports very much what you're saying about the Old Testament, is that the better way to study the Bible is to go from the New Testament to the Old Testament, because the nature of God is revealed so much more in the New Testament because of the misunderstandings and so on and so forth. And I would like to say, of course, a lot of classicism was my springboard to comparative literature, French, English, and Christianity, existentialism, etc. But I wanted to say that the role of culture, again, in the Greek, it doesn't say that the Holy Scriptures were dictated, but inspired. And so, very much like Simona says, the culture of the time, and a lot of it today too, it was a misogynic. It was the woman was there to just serve, which I love serving my family, but God's intention was different but equal, as we know. So and that coincides, and again, the fear of classism and humanism in the Adventist church. It's a serious lack, I feel humbly, because yes, we take the ugly and the changing away, but they said pretty much what Jesus said, that the being, the eternal, never changes. Is our understanding of it that changes. We have the eternal and unchanging, and we have those things that change. We'll talk very much about that. So thank you so much for bringing into light those things that are changing and should be changing because they're contrary to the nature of God. Thank you.
All right, thank you again. Okay, I don't see any hands up. David, did you want to comment, or should we bring this to a earlier conclusion?
Let me just
Oh,
suggest that if you would like to carry on with this next Sabbath, I'm going to talk about the gendering of the Trinity. And that is another new idea that was reintroduced to me. And as I've discovered, it's a very old idea. And again, one I think that we've lost. So the response to my Adventist Today article included beautiful, wonderful, it helped me so much, and absolute heresy. How dare you write this? Go start your own church type of thing. So you will help me with this, but it's a very fascinating topic. And it was, again, eye-opening to me to explore this. And I'd love to do that with you. So just to give you the teaser, let's talk about the gendering of the Trinity.
all right.
Okay, I see Dana does
Yeah,
have something
Dana
to
just
say.
raised her hand. Dana, did you?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a question, but I want to say how healing this presentation was for me, because I always believed in equality, and I always believed that the character of God is fully reflected in men and women together, not one lower than each other. So I have no words to tell you how much I appreciate your perspective and your presentation. Thank you so very much.
Okay, David, to you.
Okay.
Jack, did you want to respond to that, or just say?
No, you're welcome. And let's do it better than any of us have been able to do it before.
Okay. All right, David, to you.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Forrest. Thank you, Monty. It's been a rich occasion, and next time we talk about the gendering of the Trinity, that should be fascinating as well. So here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
I hope none of you peaked, because it's quite dangerous.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I did put blood on the lintel of my doorpost, so I'm okay.
We have
Right.
so we have so many habits and ingrained things that we just think without understanding or thinking them through. And one of the privileges of a nice class like this with open-minded people is to explore them. And why do we do that? Why don't we, like Jesus, look up to heaven when we pray?
Yeah.
But we don't. I bow my heads and close my eyes just like that little Jewish boy was taught, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to learn.
Okay. All right. I'm going to stop the recording now.